Hey there, I'm Simon from the Blender Studio. In this video, I'll walk you through creating this procedural first setup using the new hair nodes in Blender 3.5. There is another shorter video giving a quick overview of how to use the new nodes that you might want to check out if you haven't. In this video, I'll take a little bit more time and go over each step creating this setup. The file with this example is also available for download on blender.org, and it contains these 4 different animal first setups. I recommend you check them out, they're very fun to play with. In this video, we'll focus on this one specifically though. It's inspired by our fuzzy friend, the long-haired Highland cow. We'll be starting from scratch to recreate this setup, and you'll need little to no knowledge about how geometry nodes work to be able to follow. So let's get started. I'm here in Blender 3.5 and just starting out from the default scene. Let's just get rid of all the objects and instead replace them with a plane that we're gonna use as the bases. And for now, I just want to subdivide this plane a couple of times so we have a little bit more detail on the mesh. And then the easiest thing to add some hair on top of this plane as a basis is to just run the quick fur operator, which you can find in the add menu under curves. And this now adds a new curves object, which is automatically parented to the active object, which is the plane, and also selecting the plane as the surface object and its active UV map as the UV map for the curves. This is quite important to make sure that the curves are attached to the surface. And now we can already go into sculpt mode and do some grooming on top of this. And as you can see, there's already a procedural setup going on. If I go to the modifier panel, you can see that the quick fur operator already added a bunch of modifiers on top of this. If I disable all of them, you can see the original curves that you can actually sculpt on. And then there's a setup on top that adds more interpolated curves based on those, and then adds some noise and frizz on top of that. The original curves that you can actually sculpt on are marked with this white overlay. One thing I want to do is scale the plane down a little bit. Let me go into edit mode and scale it by a factor of 0.2 to get a more reasonable surface area to work with. And as you can see, as I'm scaling this around, the density of the hair does not actually change, so we get fewer hairs on the smaller surface. But there are also these strange stray hairs around this area. And that's because the actual curves, if I go into sculpt mode here, as you can see, did not actually change with the mesh. The curves and the mesh are 2 separate objects. But now that the mesh changed, we'll have to update the position of the curves. We can do that in curve sculpt mode with the operator to snap to the formed surface. And there we go. Because each curve remembered its UV coordinate, they all snap to the point on the plane where they're supposed to be. Now let me just rotate this plane into a vertical position, and then let's do some very basic grooming to just angle these curves down a little bit on the surface and make them just a little bit longer. And that is about as much grooming as we're actually going to do in this tutorial. The main part, separate from this, is just going to be a procedural setup. Next up, let's take a closer look at these modifiers. The first one here is responsible to set the thickness of the hair curves. But as you can see, if I change anything, right now we're not seeing the result. To change that, we have to go to the Render Settings tab, and in the Curves properties, change the shape to strip. And then we can also add some additional subdivision to get a nicer shape. And now you can see how this shape of the hair strands is a little bit more soft. And when we change the radius, you can see how this is actually having an effect now. Besides the radius, there's also an option to change the shape. The default of 0.5 means that it has 100% of the width at the root of the hair, and then linearly falls off to 0 at the end. The factor of that you can also control with factor max and factor min here. But you can also change the interpolation with this shape parameter. If you increase the shape, it will fall off quicker. If you reduce it, it'll fall off more slowly. And then if you go into the negatives, you will get the opposite direction. For now, let's just keep that at 0.5. The next modifier in here is called the Interpolate Hair Curves modifier. This one is responsible to interpolate the existing guide curves that you have, which we can see in the overlay here, and create more to interpolate them all over the surface object. If I just crank up the density here to, let's say, 10,000, you can see how we get a lot more curves without actually adding more into the real geometry. For this modifier, it's important to set the surface object, otherwise the result is just empty, and also the UV map, so that the curves can be attached to the surface. In this case, the quick fur operator already took care of that for us. The next modifier that was already added is a noise modifier to just distort the curves with a simple noise texture. You can crank up the distortion distance like this, or we can change the scale of the texture to get a different result. Another modifier to add some variation that already has been added is the Frizz hair curves modifier. It's a bit similar to the noise modifier as it adds some variation, but instead of using an actual noise texture that is mapped to the curves, it's just using a random value for each control point of the curves. And that makes everything very fuzzy. With the seed input, you can change between different random variations. The shape works the same as for the hair shape in the beginning. So the default of 0.5 means that we have an increasing amount of frizz along each curve. So if I crank that higher, we get less and less frizz up to the tip. And if I crank it lower, we'll get more along the entire curve. And if I go the opposite way of going into the negative values, you'll see how there's no frizz at the tip, but then stronger frizz around the roots. Same as for the noise node, same as for the noise modifier, there are also some toggles. There's, for example, the cumulative offset toggle. What this does is that the displacement node of every point is affecting the next one along the curve. So if I turn this off, the whole frizz effect is very random and uniform in all directions. But if I turn it on, you can see how it's a little bit more natural. And then there's another toggle to preserve the curve length. So that means when I increase this value, instead of the curves just getting longer and longer, it preserves the length and they just start crumpling up without actually growing. And the last modifier that is added by default is the surface deform modifier, which takes care that the curves move as the surface object is deforming. Just keep in mind that changing the actual mesh in edit mode does not count as deforming as you're changing the original mesh. But if instead I add, for example, a shape key, let's just create a basic deformation for this. And then I have the shape key actually have an effect on the mesh. You can see how the curves are moving nicely along. For that to work, it is actually important to make sure that the surface deform modifier is always at the end of the stack. And also the surface rest position toggle is enabled in the Interpolate Hair Curves modifier. So those are the basics. Now let's start with the actual custom setup. For now, let's disable the frizz to get a better picture of what is happening. Also, I want to change the viewport display color of the fur so we get a better read. Let's go for something like this. And then also in the display settings, I want to turn on shadowing and cavity in the world type. To get a realistic result, we're going to need a lot more hair. So in the Interpolate Hair Curves modifier, let's turn the density to something really high, like 1 million. Now we got a very dense curve setup. The value of 1 million is the density per square unit. So what that means in Blender here, a unit like this will have 1 million of these curves spawned in the current setup. But because this plane is a lot smaller than 1 Blender unit squared, we don't actually have 1 million curves. One way to find out how many we actually have is, for example, to go to the Geometry Nodes workspace, and then with our object selected, you can see that we're dealing with 160,000 curves right now. Of course, that is not going to be super performant when we're working on it. So one thing that I want to do is decrease the amount that we see in the viewport, while the rendering will still have this density. So for the viewport amount, let's just type in 4%. And this would make it a lot easier to work with the setup. So let's collapse the interpolation for now and just focus on the noise. The noise is the only thing that is deforming our curves right now. One thing that I want to do is make this pattern of displacement a little bit smaller. So let's crank up the scale to something like 2. And to control the strength of this effect, I actually want to use a mask that I can paint. One way of doing this is to select the base surface, and on there we can create a vertex group. Let's call this one noise strength. It's just drawing something basic. And then in the modifier, we can click on this button here to change the factor input instead of a single value into an attribute input. And here we can select the noise strength from the plane as an input. And if we go back to weight paint mode on the plane, we can see how now we can actually paint in the strength. Now that we have some variation in the base shape of the groom, let's add some more effects on top. For that, I want to actually start layering our own effects on top of what the quick fur modifier added by default. To do that, we have to open a new editor window, select the asset browser, and there, in the Essentials library, you can find all of the hair modifiers that ship with Blender 3.5. To get a better overview, let's check out the different categories. There are general deformation nodes, generation to add more curves, guide nodes to enable a guide curve based workflow, read nodes to give you information about the curves to use in the node setup, general utility nodes, and then in the right category, just the set hair curve profile node. Some of these, like this one, we've already used because they were added by the quick fur automatically. But now I want to add a new one to curl the hair. This one can be found in the guides category. But you can also just type in curl into the search. To add it to the curve object's modifier stack, you can simply drag it into the viewport and let go on top of the object. And there it is. It's already added to the end of the stack. But let me just move this right after the noise. Of course, the default settings are not quite fitting exactly. Let's change the radius to something like 2 centimeters. And let's also crank up the frequency a little bit. And there you can see what's happening. One thing I want to change is to crank up the curl start all the way up to 1, because I just want them to curl up to the tip. And because I want these curls to clump up a little bit more at the tip, I'll just change the factor end to something much lower. To get some more variation here, I'll also crank up the random offset to 0.5. And for now, that's about what I want to do with these settings. I do want to go into detail into something else though, which is the guide hair workflow. What is different about the curls compared to the modifiers that we already looked at before is that they kind of clump together a bunch of hairs into one singular shape. And that is based on the guide curves. Right now, by default, these guide curves are exactly the ones that you can edit in sculpt mode. If I take a look here, the overlay of the guide curves matches exactly the curls that are resulting from that. And if I start moving these around, you can see how I can also shift the pattern of how the curls are created. And if I delete a bunch of them, you can even see how it removes these guides entirely. But of course that doesn't remove the individual curves. The curves are still there, they're just mapped to the closest guide in their proximity. So this is one way to actually control very precisely how you want these clumps to be created. But in this case, I don't care about that too much. I just want a procedural setup that has some randomness to it. So what I can do to create this mapping of curves to guide curves more procedural is to just turn off this toggle to use the existing guide map. Now these clumps of hair are not matching what I do in the groom anymore. Instead, they're now based on these inputs here in the curl modifier. The guide distance gives you an average distance between two guides. So right now that's 10 centimeters. So in our case, let's crank this a little bit lower to something like 1 centimeter, which gives us much smaller clumps of hair. And then on top of that, I want to also use the guide mask input. The mask input will randomly remove some of the guides based on the number. On 1, nothing is removed. On 0, everything is removed, which just creates one big clump. But let's put this to something like 0.2. The result of this is kind of similar as keeping this on 1 and then just increasing this number. But the difference is that doing it this way looks a little bit more random and less uniform. So now we have a good natural base setup. Let's start adding more detail to it. The first thing I want to do is to enable the frizz again, but not the way that it is set up right now. Currently, the effect is the strongest at the tip, which will destroy the shape that we just created with the curls. So instead, I want to go for a negative shape, which will give us a stronger effect at the root and leave the tips as they are. Also, let's reduce the amount by changing the distance to something like 2 millimeters. And that just adds some more subtle variation. Next, I want to add some additional clumping. The curls already have some sort of clumping effect, but on top of this, I want to add some sub-clumping on a more granular level. So in the guides category, I'll just take the clump hair curves node and drag the asset on top of the groom. Let's make sure that it's before the surface deform. And you can see that by default, it takes the exact same guide curves that are selected by the curls. In this case, that's not what I want, because I want to add smaller clumps on top of that. So I just turn off the existing guide map toggle, and then change the guide distance to something like 1 millimeter. That creates very small clumps on top of what we already have. And then also I want to reduce the guide mask to 0.1, which will essentially throw away 90% of the guides in the selection, which makes it look more natural and a little bit more random. Of course, you can always play around with these values. I also want to make these clumps a little bit stronger so that they start earlier towards the root. For that I can change the shape. If I reduce this value, I get a stronger clumping effect. Now, before we continue adding more detail to this, I actually want to see this rendered. Because remember, this is not the full density of curves. If I put this viewport amount back to 100%, we see the entirety of this very thick groom. So something we definitely have to reduce is the thickness of the individual curves. Let's go for 0.2 millimeters. And that looks a little bit better for the density. Okay, for now let's turn this back to 4% and add a little bit of a rendering setup. Let's add in a camera object that just looks straight at the groom. Change the resolution to be square format, adjust the focal length, and now let's just add some lights in a separate collection. I want to have just a very basic lighting setup. Add a fill light from the top with a little bit of a warm tone. Then a relatively small key light. It's coming a little bit from the side. And a rim light from the other side. With a little bit of a cold tone. And for the world, let's just crank down the color a little bit and push it more towards blue. And we can still tweak all of that later, but for now, let's go ahead and do a simple shading setup. For the shader, we do want to use nodes. And we're just going to use the principled hair BSDF. That works only for cycles, so if you want to use Eevee, make sure to just use the regular principled BSDF. I want to have some more precise control over the color, so I'm just going to keep this as direct coloring. And then we're going to use the curve info node to be able to use this information for the shader. I'm going to use the intercept to get a gradient from the root to the tip and plug that into the factor input of a mix node. Set that to color. And then there I'm going to select a darker color for the root and a brighter, more reddish color for along the tip. To get a better idea of the lighting, let's give the surface object a shader as well, where we turn off the specular and just crank down the color. There we go, it looks a lot better. I'll also turn on the denoising for the viewport and enable the normal input to get a better result. And that looks already not so bad. Now let's give this an actual render. Alright, so this doesn't even have to render all the way through. We can already identify a couple of issues. So one thing is that these clumps are still very uniform. So we want to add some additional detail like stray hairs that are going between different clumps. And then also the individual hairs have all the same length, which results in these kinds of shapes. There can also be some variation in the shader, and it would also be nice to vary up the curling a little bit more. So let's get to work. First up, let's just work a little bit more in this shading setup. One thing that I want to do is use a noise texture to create some variation in the color. Let's just add a noise texture node. And for the vector, instead of leaving the input open as it is, I'm going to use the attribute input node. And there, what I type in is surface UV coordinate with underscores. And if we just take a look at that, you can see how that nicely gives us the UV information of the surface for each individual curve. You can use this, for example, also to do texture painting on the surface and then use this attribute as the vector input for your image texture. But instead of doing actual image texture painting here, I simply just want to use this noise texture. Let's change the parameters a little bit to crank up the scale and the detail a little bit. And then use another mix node, set this one to soft light, and then use a color ramp to map the variation that we want to include. So here let's play with the colors a little bit, and that creates a little bit more variation for us. On top of that, we can duplicate this node to also add some variation for each individual curve, and that results in a color map like this. And then for the shader node itself, we can also add some randomization to the roughness, and then let's tweak the roughness values themselves a little bit also to increase that a little bit. That makes everything look a little bit more fuzzy. So let's get into more detail with this setup. One thing that I mentioned I wanted to do is to randomize the length of these curves a little bit. For that, I can use the trim hair curves node. Let's just drag it on top, and by default it creates a little bit of a mess, because what it does is that it trims the hair to a specific length, which right now it's set to 1 meter. I don't want to do this here though, so let's turn off replace length, and then by default it doesn't change anything, but what I want to add is some random offset. So let's randomize the length by something like 5 millimeters. Here that doesn't have a very obvious result, but when we crank this back to 100%, you can see that it makes the tips a little bit more fuzzy. Another thing I want to do is to, at the very end, add some variation by rotating the curves individually as well. You can change the random offset here, and you can see how it makes the ends just a little bit more fuzzy. I want this effect to be quite subtle though, so let's put this to a low value like 5 degrees. And also let's make sure to move the surface deform back to the end. Some of these effects we don't really need to see in the viewport because they're only really important for the render resolution of the density. So we can just turn them off of the viewport and have a little bit of a benefit in terms of performance. If we just go through here, we can see which ones are really important and change the shape significantly. So far for this setup, we've only been focusing on the modifier stack, and we've already gotten quite a nice result. But to really embrace the true power of this new hair node setup, we can actually move this to geometry nodes and use all the other nodes in combination with it. That doesn't have to be super complicated though. Let me show you a little bit how you can take this setup to the next level without knowing all too much about geometry nodes at all. Let's first move to the geometry nodes workspace. And right now you don't really need the spreadsheet editor, so let's instead turn this into an asset browser. And here you can see in the node editor how all of these modifiers that we've been working with all have their own node tree representation in the node editor. And as I'm going through these, you might be thinking that these look a little bit daunting and complicated. But don't worry, you don't have to go into these setups and understand what is going on at all. The way to use these in geometry nodes for your grooming workflow is rather to use these setups as a single node in a higher level node tree. Let me show you what that means. For example, let's go back to the frizz that we added. I want to add some variation and randomization to the input so that not every single curve gets the same strength of frizz. And the easiest way to do that is to do it in geometry nodes. But rather than going inside of the node tree that makes up the logic of this frizz modifier, I just want to make a simple geometry node setup to plug it into the factory here. And the easiest way to do that is to use an operator that is new in Blender 3.5, which you can find in this menu, and it is called move to nodes. So when I click and execute that operator, it creates an entirely new node tree, which is just the node version of the Frizz modifier that we had just before. So effectively, nothing changed during this operation. It still looks the exact same because all the values that we put in here are still preserved in the node. But now we're able to incorporate this into a node tree. So now I can just mute this node individually to turn off and on the Frizz. And more importantly, I can drive all the inputs of this node individually with node setups. For the factor, for example, now I can use a random value node. And right now, this gives me a random value for every single point of these curves. What I want instead is a random value per curve. To get that, I can simply change the ID input to use the curve ID. This node here, the curve info, is also part of the essentials library in the read category. I just press Ctrl H to hide the inputs we don't need. And there we go. Now we have a different random strength for every curve. Now let's change a little bit the range of this random value. Rather than just using these two parameters, I want to instead use a map range node. That gives me more settings, as now I can change the mapping entirely. Let's put the from min value to 0.8. And that essentially means that 80% of the curves will end up with a value of 0. So only a few of them actually receive the Frizz. Let's turn the distance up a little bit to see more of the effect. And now if I mute this connection, you can see the difference this makes. It really tones down the effect. If you're more comfortable with that, you can also use a color ramp instead of the map range node. That way it's a little bit easier to see what's happening. The equivalent of what I just did with the map range node is essentially putting this slider to the position of 0.8. You can also get a preview of what this is doing by holding down Shift Control, clicking on the group input and then the color ramp, and then you can see the effect of this mask and how it looks like when I change the inputs. So now that we know how to properly add more flexible control to the inputs, let's keep doing that to some of the other ones as well. For example, one of the most important modifiers here, the curl. Again, this setup looks quite complicated, but instead we're just going to focus on using this as a single node. So let's move this to another node tree. And then there it is, the node representation of the modifier we've been working with, where we can change all the inputs based on a node system now. First off, let's do a similar thing to what we just did with the Frizz, which is adding a random value input to the factor and base that on the curve ID to make sure that we get a different value per curve instead of per point. And then let's add a ramp again, which I'm going to adjust to something like this. And you can see how that adds some more variation to the setup compared to what it was before. Another thing that I want to do is add some variation to the frequency of the curl. Quick reminder, this is what it looks like when I change the value. But what I want to do here is to actually change the frequency along the curve so that at the base it's a lot smoother and the curl cranks up its frequency towards the tip. To do that, let's just add in a spline parameter node. So let's take a look at this factor input. That gives us a nice factor that goes from 0 to 1 along the spline. And then when I connect this to a map range node and plug it into the frequency, you can see how now we can control the frequency independently at the root and at the tip. So if I put both to 2, that's essentially what we had before. But if I lower it for the root, it gives us a softer fall off at the beginning. And if I then increase it at the tip, that gives me exactly the result that I wanted to. This effect adds some overall interest to the shape, and it's also a little bit more realistic, as due to gravity, there's a lot more pull at the roots of the hair than there is at the tip. Let's again look at the comparison by muting this input. It's relatively subtle, but I think it adds quite a bit. Now let's add another layer of detail on top of this. I want to add some stray hairs that individually go off of the path that the other ones are taking. For that, let's just add a noise. And this one right now is affecting all the hair at the same time. But we're immediately going to move this into its own node tree. And there, to the factor, we're going to add a random value again. Same as before, we connect the curve ID. But here, I want this to either affect a curve or not at all. So I don't need the float map, which goes from 0 to 1 gradually, but instead I can just take a Boolean, which is either 0 or 1. And now we can specifically control the amount of curves that are affected by this noise. If I put this to something like 0.1, we get this effect of individual runaway curves of hair that are just floating away. I want this to be a little bit more random, so I'm going to increase the scale of the noise texture. And right now it's a little bit too strong of an effect, so let's change the distance to 5 millimeters. So that looks quite decent right now. For the stray hairs, let's also increase the scale along each curve to make it a little bit more fuzzy, and then make sure to move it up in the modifier stack. And now it's time for some final details. Because these clumps are still a little bit uniform, I want to add another clumping on top. So I go to the clump modifier that we have here, and again move it into another node tree. And then in here we can just go ahead and duplicate this node. And then there I'll increase the guide distance a little bit to something like 4 millimeters and put the mask to something like 0.25. And now we have an additional layer of clumping, which gives us a little bit more variation. Let's tweak the shape. So the really strong clumping is going to be the smaller one here. And then we have a little bit more subtle clumping that goes more towards the tip before that. For this, let's also add a clump offset, which for each clump will offset the tips a little bit. This is probably a little bit too strong. Let's go for something like 5 millimeters. And then let's add a little bit more detail in the very end, right after the stray hairs. And I want to add another frizz. You can just take that here from the asset browser and straight up drag it into the node editor. And for this, I'm going to again use a random input for each curve with the curve ID. Let's take another color ramp to get more control over this. Let's do something around this. And here again, I don't want to affect the tips all too much. So instead I'm going to choose a negative shape. Let's go for something like 0.2 in the negative. Right now that's still way too strong, so let's tone that down to something like 2 millimeters distance. And that just gives us some overall nice variation and fuzziness. To make sure that the tips of the clumps are not getting too fuzzy, let's turn off the cumulative offset for this frizz node here, so that the tips are not being affected too much, but each point just individually jittered a little bit. Now we have a little bit of a dip in the pattern that we get from the overall noise. So let's just hide all the other modifiers that you have to take a closer look at the noise, to just go for something that's a little bit nicer. Maybe like this. And this is looking pretty good. Now this is already the entire setup that I wanted to show you. But this setup already includes a whole bunch of parameters, and you don't necessarily get them right the first time. So to be able to tweak everything, it's much easier when you can actually see the entire resolution while you're tweaking it. So one thing we can do is to go to the surface and then there add something like, for example, a mask modifier. And then there we can just select a patch of faces in the center, where we create a new vertex group that we call mask, and assign these vertices to, which then we can use in the mask modifier. So now we just have a small amount of hair, where if we go to the full density, we have much less of a hard time with the performance. So now it's a lot easier to tweak the settings, having a better preview of what it's going to look like in the full resolution. But overall, I'm already quite happy. Just need to make sure that the mask modifier doesn't apply to the rendering. And then let's give this a render how it is right now. And there we have it. This is the final result of what we've accomplished in this tutorial. Now you can definitely, if you want to, spend more time tweaking this in detail, especially when looking at reference. But this is the essential setup that I've been using for this example file. In there though, I've been doing most of these operations entirely in the node tree, which makes it a little bit easier to have an overview. But organizing these node setups in individual modifiers is also definitely an option that has its benefits. Okay, I hope that gave you a good first impression of how to use these new nodes in your grooming workflow, even without needing to know necessarily all that much about geometry nodes. That said, if you do feel like you could use a boost in your understanding of geometry nodes, I made a course on the Blender Studio platform explaining everything you need to know to get started with geometry nodes on a fundamental level. I made it almost 1 year ago now, but all the information still holds true, and I do think it's worth checking out. But anyways, thanks for sticking around for the video, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.